It is the 19th of February, 1945, and the island of Iwo Jima is rising out of the smoke like something from a nightmare. 8 square miles of volcanic ash, ringed with concrete bunkers, sits beneath a sky thick with naval gunfire. On the beach, a young Marine called Brown crouches behind a radio set, a handset pressed to his ear, and begins speaking. The words that come out of his mouth are not English. They are not any language a Japanese codebreaker has ever catalogued, studied, or even heard before. They flow strangely, full of tones and clicks, rising and falling in patterns that sound, to an untrained ear, like nothing at all. A few 100 meters away, dug into the volcanic rock, Japanese radio operators are listening. They have broken American codes before. They will not break this one. What that Marine is speaking is Navajo, transformed into one of the most effective military codes ever devised. He is one of around 400 men collectively known as the Navajo Code Talkers, and on this beach, in this battle, 6 of them are about to do something extraordinary. Over the next 2 days, they will send and receive more than 800 messages, coordinating artillery, requesting reinforcements, redirecting landing craft, all without a single error. The Japanese will intercept every word. They will understand none of it. This is not a story about a machine, though machines come into it. It is not a story about a weapon, though it shaped how weapons were used. It is the story of a language, spoken on a reservation in the American Southwest, unwritten for most of its existence, dismissed by outsiders as primitive. That became the only spoken military code in modern history that was never broken. To understand why it worked, you have to go back 3 years, to a man who should not really have had anything to do with the war at all, and to a problem the United States Marine Corps was beginning to think had no solution. By the early months of 1942, the war in the Pacific had become a contest of secrets. Every order, every troop movement, every coordinate radioed between ships and units was a sentence the enemy was trying to read over your shoulder. Japan's signals intelligence services were formidable. Across the previous decade, they had built up cryptanalytic units capable of working through American military codes with real speed, and the United States knew it. Codes that had seemed secure in peacetime were being compromised within weeks of contact. Mechanical cipher systems existed, certainly, but they were slow, and slow was dangerous. A coded order that took half an hour to encrypt, transmit, and decrypt was an order that might arrive too late to matter, particularly in the brutal close-quarters fighting that characterized amphibious landings across the Pacific Islands. The numbers told their own story. Standard encryption machines of the period required around 30 minutes to encode, transmit, and decode a typical 3-line field message. 30 minutes on a beach under fire is an eternity. Mortar positions shift. Landing craft change course. A request for naval gunfire support that arrives 40 minutes late might land on ground the Marines have already taken, or worse, ground they have already been pushed back from. Commanders needed something that could move at the speed of the battle itself, not the speed of a cipher clerk turning the wheels of a machine. There had been earlier attempts to solve this exact problem using an unconventional idea, encoding messages not through mathematics, but through language itself. During the First World War, members of the Choctaw Nation serving with American forces had transmitted messages over field telephones in their own language, and German listeners, however skilled, had no frame of reference for what they were hearing. It worked in a limited way, on a limited scale. But by 1918 it was a curiosity rather than a program, and in the intervening decades the idea had largely been forgotten by military planners. What made the situation in 1942 different and more urgent was scale. The Pacific Campaign was not going to be a handful of isolated engagements. It was going to be island after island, year after year, an unrelenting sequence of amphibious assaults against a well-dug-in, highly capable enemy. Any code used across that campaign would face sustained pressure from Japanese cryptanalysts with every passing month to find a weakness, a pattern, a crack. A code that merely held for a few weeks was not good enough. The Marine Corps needed something that could survive years of enemy attention without ever giving way, and it needed it fast. The man who proposed the answer was, on paper, an unlikely candidate to be solving a military communications crisis. Philip Johnston was a civil engineer from Los Angeles, 50 years old in 1942 and consequently too old for combat service, the son of Protestant missionaries who had raised him on the Navajo reservation that stretched across Arizona and New Mexico. Johnston had grown up speaking Navajo, a language unique to reservation dwellers and rarely used anywhere else, in which inflection could change a word's meaning entirely. He had served in France during the First World War and had, by some accounts, heard there of the Choctaw experiment. Reading about the military's renewed hunt for an unbreakable code in early 1942, he thought of home. Navajo was, in 1942, almost entirely unwritten. There was no published dictionary, no widely available grammar, no textbook a foreign intelligence service could acquire and study. Outside the Navajo Nation itself, the language was understood by a vanishingly small number of people. American military assessment at the time suggested fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the country had anything beyond a superficial grasp of it. Crucially, nobody in the Axis camp was among them. German researchers had spent the interwar years studying a number of Native American languages, but Navajo, by the Marine Corps' own later assessment, had not been one of them. Johnston took his idea to Camp Elliott near San Diego in February 1942 and arranged a demonstration for skeptical Marine officers. He brought 4 bilingual Navajo men with him. 2 were sent to a separate room and given a standard military field order in English. Their task was to translate it into Navajo, transmit it by radio to their companions elsewhere in the building, and have it translated back into English on the other end. The test showed that Navajo speakers could encode, transmit, and decode a 3-line message in around 20 seconds, against the 30 minutes required by contemporary cipher machines. It was not a marginal improvement, it was a different order of magnitude entirely, and it was enough to convince Major General Clayton Vogel, who recommended that 200 Navajo men be recruited into the program. The technical innovation that followed was more careful and more clever than simply speaking a foreign language down a telephone line. Vogel's recommendation led to the recruitment of the first 29 volunteers, who arrived for training in the summer of 1942 and were organized into Platoon 382, the first all-Navajo unit in Marine Corps history. After completing standard recruit training, this small group was sent to develop something that did not yet exist. A working code built on their own language, dense enough to defeat analysis, simple enough to memorize under combat conditions, and fast enough to be useless to anyone except the men who had built it. What they produced operated on 2 layers. The first was a phonetic alphabet. Each letter of the English alphabet was assigned a Navajo word, chosen for an everyday object whose Navajo name began with that letter's English sound when translated. The Navajo word Wolachi, meaning ant, stood for the letter A. So did Belasana, meaning apple, and Tsinil, meaning axe. Having 3 options for the most common letters mattered enormously. A code that always used the same word for the same letter would eventually betray its own patterns to a patient enemy. Varying the choice broke up the rhythm a cryptanalyst relies on. The second layer was a dedicated vocabulary of several hundred Navajo words, standing directly for military terms that had no equivalent in the language at all, because the language had never needed them. A submarine became Besh Lo, meaning iron fish. A dive bomber became Guinea, the word for a chicken hawk because of the way the bird hunts. America itself became Nehema, meaning our mother. This vocabulary began at around 200 terms and grew to over 400 as the war progressed, and every one of those terms had to be committed entirely to memory. Code talkers were forbidden from writing any of it down. There was no paper version to be captured, lost, or stolen from a dead man's pocket. The only place the code existed was inside the heads of the men who had built it. This was, in its way, the master stroke. Even a captured Navajo speaker who had no part in the program could not decipher it, because the substitutions were arbitrary, agreed in advance, and bore no relation to ordinary Navajo usage. A message encoded this way did not sound like Navajo to a Navajo listener who was not trained in the code. It sounded like nonsense. Strings of words for animals and household objects strung together with no apparent sense. To use it, a code talker had to perform several mental operations at once, translating Navajo back into English, taking only the first letter of each English word, and reassembling the result, all while under fire, all without slowing down. For the place name Tarawa, a code talker might transmit the Navajo words for turkey, ant, rabbit, ant, and weasel, each one collapsing down to a single letter, spelling the word out one careful piece at a time. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing at all. The program expanded rapidly once its value was proven. Training moved to Camp Pendleton at Oceanside, California, where new recruits arrived after completing ordinary Marine Corps boot camp and were then put through several additional weeks of intensive instruction, learning the code from scratch and being tested relentlessly on speed and accuracy before deployment. By August 1943, the Pendleton program had trained nearly 200 Navajo Marines, with Philip Johnston, now a staff sergeant, overseeing much of the administration himself. Eventually, somewhere between 375 and 420 men trained as code talkers specifically, out of a total of roughly 540 Navajo Marines who served during the war, drawn from a Navajo population of around 50,000 people at the time. The first operational use came at Guadalcanal in 1942, where code talkers attached to the 1st Marine Division began transmitting tactical messages from the earliest weeks of the campaign. From there, the record reads like a roll call of the Pacific War's worst fighting: Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan, Okinawa. Code talkers served in every assault the Marine Corps carried out in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945, attached to all 6 Marine divisions, as well as raider battalions and parachute units. They worked from foxholes, from the backs of tanks, from aircraft, often within meters of the front line, because that was where the radios were needed. Nowhere is the record clearer or more dramatic than at Iwo Jima in February 1945. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer, had 6 Navajo code talkers working continuously through the first 2 days of the landing. Between them, they transmitted more than 800 messages without a single error. Connor's later verdict was blunt, and often quoted since, that without the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima at all. Whether that statement is read as a precise military judgment or a commander's heartfelt tribute, it reflects how indispensable the code talkers had become to operations by that stage of the war. What makes the achievement remarkable is not simply that the code worked, but that it was never even partially compromised, in an environment where Japanese signals intelligence was actively, persistently trying to break it. After the war, Japan's own wartime chief of intelligence, Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, acknowledged that while his codebreakers had succeeded against codes used by the U.S. Army and Army Air Corps, they had never managed to crack the code used by the Marine Corps. There is a story, often repeated, of a Navajo man captured by Japanese forces in the Philippines, where he had been serving separately with the Army, who was made to listen to recordings of code talker transmissions and could make nothing of them. After the war, he reportedly told a code talker that he had never worked out what on earth they had all been saying. It is worth comparing this to what else was happening elsewhere in the war's intelligence battles, because the contrast sharpens just how unusual the Navajo solution was. The German Enigma machine, perhaps the most famous cipher system of the conflict, was a marvel of mechanical engineering, but it depended entirely on mathematics, on rotor settings and plugboard configurations that, however vast the number of possible combinations, were ultimately systematic, and therefore, with sufficient computing power and captured material, breakable. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park did exactly that, building early computing machines specifically to attack Enigma's logic. The Navajo code had no such logic to attack. It was not built from mathematics at all. It was built from a living, spoken language layered with an additional arbitrary substitution code that existed nowhere on paper. There was no machine to capture, no settings to steal, no underlying system that, once understood, would unravel the whole. The Japanese had themselves used a small number of native Hawaiian and other personnel in limited communications roles, and the German military had, before the war, dispatched researchers to study various Native American languages out of a general interest in linguistics and ethnography. Navajo, conveniently, was reported to be the one major language group those pre-war researchers had not studied. Whether by luck or judgment, the United States had found the one gap in an otherwise reasonably well-mapped linguistic landscape, and it exploited that gap for the rest of the war. It is also worth being honest about what this story is not. It was not the only Code Talker program. At least 14 other Native nations, including the Cherokee and the Comanche, served as Code Talkers across both the Pacific and European theaters, with the Comanche, notably, operating in France from soon after the Normandy landings. The Navajo program is simply the largest, the best documented, and the one that has come to stand, in public memory, for the entire concept. Some details of the wider program remain thin. Casualty figures among Code Talkers, exact deployment rosters for certain operations, and the full administrative history of the Pacific Signals War are still being pieced together by historians, partly because the program's strict secrecy meant many records were never compiled with future researchers in mind. That secrecy is itself part of the story's strange afterlife. Because the code remained a closely guarded military asset, the Navajo Code Talkers were forbidden from discussing their wartime work, even with their own families, for more than 2 decades after the war ended. The program was not declassified until 1968. Men who had transmitted the orders that helped take some of the most fiercely contested ground in the Pacific went home to reservations that, in several states, still would not let them vote and could not tell anyone what they had actually done in the war. Navajo people were denied the right to vote in Arizona until 1948, in New Mexico until 1953, and in Utah until 1957, despite the citizenship granted to all Native Americans under federal law in 1924. Recognition, when it finally came slowly and then all at once. President Ronald Reagan declared the 14th of August, 1982 to be National Navajo Code Talkers Day. In 2000, Congress authorized the Congressional Gold Medal for the original 29 men of Platoon 382, awarded the following year, by which point only 4 of them were still alive to receive it in person. The rest were honored posthumously. A further 225 Code Talkers, recruited into the program after that first group, received the Congressional Silver Medal that same November. A permanent exhibition at the Pentagon has displayed the original code, alongside photographs and equipment, since 1992. As of early 2026, only a small handful of the original World War II Navajo Code Talkers remain alive, the youngest of them now well into their 90s, and the living link to that first generation is closing. The legacy of the program is harder to measure than its wartime success, because so much of what it achieved is counted in things that did not happen, messages that were not intercepted, ambushes that were not sprung because an artillery request arrived in time, landings that were not thrown into chaos by a captured cipher. Historians broadly agree the Code Talkers shortened engagements and saved lives, though precise figures for lives saved are, by the nature of the claim, unknowable rather than merely classified. What is measurable is the unbroken record itself. No Navajo code transmission was ever successfully decrypted by Japanese intelligence throughout the entire war, a claim that can be made about almost no other major Allied cipher system of comparable scale and duration. The deeper legacy may be cultural rather than strictly military. a language that government boarding schools had spent decades trying to erase from their pupils, sometimes through outright punishment for speaking it, turned out to be the thing that helped win battles. The mathematics of cryptography could not secure on its own. Several of the code talkers later reflected that the oral traditions of memory and storytelling they had grown up with on the reservation, skills explicitly devalued by the institutions meant to assimilate them, were precisely what let them hold 400 code words in their heads without ever writing one down. The Navajo Nation Museum in Window Rock, Arizona, and the exhibit at the Pentagon both preserve elements of the original code today, alongside survivor testimony collected through oral history projects before that testimony, too, is lost. Go back to that beach on Iwo Jima, February 1945, smoke rolling across volcanic ash, and listen again to the sounds coming from that radio handset. To the Japanese operators straining to make sense of it, it is noise, a wall of unfamiliar syllables with no pattern they can find a way into. To the Marine on the other end, it is precision, a grid reference, a request for fire support, an order to hold or to move, arriving in seconds rather than the better part of an hour. Two men hearing the exact same sounds, living in two entirely different realities, and that gap between what the enemy heard and what it actually meant is the whole of the achievement. 400 men. A language with no alphabet of its own a century before. A code with no machine behind it, no key to steal, no logic to unpick. It was tested against the finest signals intelligence services in the Pacific for 3 years running, and it did not yield once. Not a single transmission cracked. Not a single message read by an enemy who badly, desperately wanted to read it. They were told to stay silent.